Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Slow, Calculated Lynching, The Story of Clyde Kennard, by Devery S. Anderson. Foreword by James Meredith. Narrated by James Fouhey. Foreword. James Meredith. Like Clyde Kennard's family, mine owned land and felt the satisfaction that comes from achieving that part of the American dream. Like Clyde Kennard, I served my country in the military and lived for a time overseas, where I served at Tachikawa Air Force Base near Tokyo, Japan. Another similarity between Clyde Kennard and myself was the fact that we valued education. I took classes while in the military, and so did he. My years as a soldier taught me that when I was overseas, I was seen as a different man from what I was regarded in my own country. Around 1956 or 1957, I was stationed at the Wendover Air Force Base in Utah, just east of the Nevada border. It was here where the atomic bomb was first tested in the 1940s. During my time in Utah, I visited the Mormon temple in Salt Lake City, and they told me in so many words to get your black ass out of here. That is something I will never forget. I was shocked, but it was probably one of the best things that ever happened to me. I probably never would have gone to Ole Miss without that experience. That moment of racial discrimination played a major role in my decision. Indeed, the North had its racial problems, but while still in the military, I became aware of just how tense the race issue was in the South. I knew that it had reached a boiling point at around the same time I had my experience in Salt Lake City. When I was discharged in 1960, I returned to my home state, where I saw in ways that had never registered with me before just how freedom had eluded black citizens in the past and continued to do so. That being the case, I came back to Mississippi determined to break down the system of white supremacy. Like Clyde Kennard, I valued an education, as did all my brothers and sisters. Some of them attended college, some did not, but all of us graduated from high school. After my discharge, I enrolled first at what is now Jackson State University, a historically black school. But I knew this was only the beginning. I knew that I had to do more. During my first quarter at Jackson State, I began to develop ideas on what it was I needed to do. I did not like some of the strategies of the civil rights movement, but I knew that I had to break down segregation and fight for racial equality in the South my own way. And my way was to insist on my right to an education at the school of my choice. I did not really care where I did it. I did not feel destined to attend the University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss as it is called. But that school, located in the city of Oxford, turned out to be the most probable place, in my mind, to register. I sent a letter requesting an application and copy of the university catalog the day after President John F. Kennedy was inaugurated in January 1961. Kennedy's stand on civil rights during his inaugural address gave me hope that any obstacle I faced in challenging white supremacy in Mississippi would ultimately be thwarted by federal intervention. At least, this would be the federal government's chance to put its money where its mouth was. I knew it would not be easy, and there was precedent for that realization. 1 month after my August 1960 discharge from the Air Force, Clyde Kennard was arrested as an accessory to a criminal offense. 2 months later, he was convicted of that crime. Few doubted the fact that he had been railroaded, and that the real reason this happened to him was that he tried, more than once, to enroll at the college of his choice, one near his home, one that had always been off limits to black students. Clyde Kennard's attempt to integrate a white school came after the U.S. Supreme Court decided in Brown v. Board of Education that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. He had the law on his side. When I sought enrollment at Ole Miss, the law was on my side also. But that did not matter in Mississippi. From the moment of the Supreme Court ruling, Mississippi decided to fight back. Kennard lost his battle to get the state to conform to the law, and he paid a heavy price for those efforts. I had two men in mind when I decided to enroll at Ole Miss. A Gulfport minister named Clyde Kennard had tried to get into that same institution several years before me. I was angered by how school and state officials treated him and what they did to get rid of him. They denied his entrance and even committed him briefly to a mental institution. Later came Clyde Kennard, who tried to enroll at Mississippi Southern College, now the University of Southern Mississippi, USM, in Hattiesburg. His story was different than mine in both the tactics Kennard used and the outcome that put him in the state penitentiary. We were both denied outright to attend our respective universities and denied more than once. In Kennard's case, it was 3 times. Medgar Evers, who intervened on Kennard's behalf, also advised me in my efforts, and I filed a lawsuit in May 1961 in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Mississippi. The state lost, but appealed. Eventually, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on my behalf, but that did not make things any easier. Governor Ross Barnett remained as defiant as ever that segregation would be maintained in Mississippi. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy intervened. President Kennedy intervened. Once it was determined that I would be allowed to register, a riot broke out on campus. 2 people were killed. It took thousands of National Guard troops, nationalized by the Kennedy administration, to quell the violence and allow me my rightful place on campus. Known as the Battle of Oxford, it was a defining moment in racial segregation in the South. Yes, Clyde Kennard's story is different than mine, but only in its outcome, not in its roots. It is an important part of Mississippi's fight to maintain white supremacy, and the state was willing to do whatever was necessary to maintain it. In this book, Devery S. Anderson has dug deeply into that story to tell it in full for the first time. As his notes and bibliography reveal, he did his homework. He details the life of a man whom all Americans should know, and he tells a story that should anger anyone who cares about justice. Anderson interviewed well over 60 individuals and researched in several archives. He scoured numerous newspapers. He located hard-to-find documents. His knack for researching and leaving no stone unturned in the process is impressive. His passion for his subject is evident. Clyde Kennard is known to scholars of the civil rights movement, but his name is not familiar to most Americans. It needs to be. He paved the way for many, and some, like me, learned from his mistakes as well as his perseverance. My hope is that this book goes a long way in finally giving Clyde Kennard his due. Prologue. No better teacher than courage. How he refused bitterness, how deep his courage ran, one cannot but marvel at him. Knowing a story like that of Clyde Kennard allows each of us to be a better person. There is no better teacher than courage. Clyde Kennard is a great teacher. Robert Shetterly, Clarion Ledger, November 16, 2013. Around 80 people gathered in the Langston Room, a long, narrow meeting place at Busboys and Poets on 14th Street in Washington, D.C. The restaurant, bookstore, and events venue, established in 2005, had already become an institution, and today 9 locations thrive throughout the metropolitan area. Founded by artist and activist Andy Shalal, an Iraqi immigrant, Busboys and Poets fast became a progressive hangout, a place where writers write, and liberals harness their idealism and devise ways to make the world better. The name Busboys and Poets refers to Langston Hughes, 1902 to 1967, who in the 1920s worked as a busboy at the Wardman Park Hotel before gaining fame as one of America's greatest poets. Americans opposed to the March 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq found their anger escalating throughout the duration of the war, and naturally, some found solace at a gathering place such as busboys and poets, which quickly became the glue that kept them connected. Those who came to the flagship location on November 14, 2013, were there to meet and honor artist Robert Shetterly, but they had also come to pay tribute to Clyde Kennard, the man whose portrait Shetterly was there to unveil, a man dead for over 50 years. Kennard, a black Mississippian once targeted by the state's most powerful segregationists, suffered for years at their hands simply because he had sought to acquire his share of the American dream. From the beginning, Shetterly, like most progressives, stood firmly against the Iraq War. That opposition became the catalyst for his painting people like Kennard in the first place. The world changed on September 11, 2001. For some, that change spurred on action. For Shetterly, 9/11, but more particularly, its aftermath, inspired the next step in what had been a lifetime of finding his voice and using art to express it. Shetterly had lived his adult years in Maine, but was born in Cincinnati to an upper-middle-class white family and raised there. His brother, a student at Harvard, declared to his mother and father in 1964 that he was heading down to Mississippi to help blacks register to vote as part of the ambitious project known as Freedom Summer. Stunned, his parents did their best to persuade him otherwise, but to no avail. Before he left for the South, he encouraged Robert to read the writings of such notable figures as James Baldwin. Through Baldwin and other thinkers, Shetterly changed his worldview on matters of race and history. When he later went on to college, he became involved not only in civil rights, but also in anti-war activism. Art had always been an integral part of who he was, and poetry was his earliest means of expression. This changed after he and his brothers took a trip to the Soviet Union. They moved about by rail, which took them next to Western Europe. Throughout their travels, they visited the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, the Louvre in Paris, and other museums throughout Germany and Italy. As he beheld the world's greatest art for the first time, he felt inspired to articulate his voice through this medium. Its visceral connection felt more powerful than words. When he returned to Maine, he began drawing and even enrolled in a course to hone his skills. He developed his talents primarily on his own, however, and within a few years, he had become skilled enough to secure work as an illustrator. With Leonardo, Degas, and Picasso as his inspiration, he kept learning and eventually took up painting. By then, he was living off the grid and feeding his family from crops raised on his own land. He began drawing for Farmstead magazine, found work illustrating books, and provided drawings for the editorial page of the counterculture paper Maine Times. Over time, his work became more surreal, influenced by Francisco de Goya's etchings and the dark, funny, lyrical, and poetical messages they sent. Shetterly's art became his livelihood, and he wanted people to use their imaginations and experience to find meaning from the images he created. After 9/11, Shetterly became distraught with all the government fear-mongering about Iraq. First, it was Afghanistan, but the push for a conflict against Iraq came almost immediately. For Shetterly, who believed the Bush administration had lied to Americans to garner support, this was too much. I just went berserk, almost literally. I was so angry. We've all seen this way too many times since Vietnam, except not on this scale. He had to do something and to find a voice with what I do best, which is paint, to somehow do something positive so that I wasn't ranting all the time. I was driving myself and my wife crazy. By using that energy to create something positive, the thought came almost immediately, why don't I start surrounding myself with people that make me feel good about this country rather than rant about the ones who enrage me? In early 2002, as the political debate became more intense, he thought about who he might paint first, while, almost literally banging my head in my wall, He looked up at a quote from Walt Whitman he had taped up in his studio. Whitman, a 19th-century journalist and poet whose views on sexuality and slavery made him a controversial figure in his day, was a true Democrat, small d, who believed fully in equality of all species. He unabashedly criticized greed and corruption as exemplified in America's Gilded Age in his 1871 pamphlet, Democratic Vistas. He published his greatest work, Leaves of Grass, in 1855, poems that spoke to humankind's endless capabilities and of divinity as something to be discovered and tapped through nature. He expanded and revised the book 8 times before his death in 1892. The quote that commanded Shetterly's attention was from the book's first edition preface. "This is what you shall do. Love the earth and sun and the animals, despise riches, give alms to everyone who asks, stand up for the stupid and crazy, devote your income and labor to others, hate tyrants, argue not concerning God, have patience and indulgence toward the people, take off your hat to nothing known or unknown." This was Shetterly's cue, or more accurately, his calling, to start with Whitman. I'd never painted a portrait in my life, so I had to figure out how to do that. He had always tried to speak through his art, but now his goal was to use it to become a better citizen. And whatever influence it may or may not have, I'm going to feel better. Through Whitman, he reconnected with something essential about the way America was supposed to be. He borrowed books from the library, found some black and white photos as inspiration, and went to work, painting on a 30 by 36 wood panel so that he could scratch the quote that inspired him into the surface of the finished piece. He knew he could not stop at Whitman, and laid out a plan to paint around 50 such portraits, each requiring extensive research so that he could come to know his subjects and feel some intimacy toward them. It was all therapeutic. He called this series Americans Who Tell the Truth. He focused at first on 19th century figures, but in time he became fixated on the living also. The intensity and dedication driving the project forced him to give up his other art and thus his income, but it was a leap of faith he needed to take. He assumed the project would consume him for a time, the portraits possibly seen by his eyes only, and then he'd move on. If the paintings simply accumulated in his basement, that was all right. He was doing this for himself. But he never stopped. Before long, the project took on a life of its own. He featured his first 50 paintings in a book named after his series, published in 2005. As he continued, his method never changed, and the rewards are always the same. He dives deep into the research of his various subjects and finds himself fascinated by their courage, determination, and the place they carved for themselves within society. I was able to start reinterpreting American history through the eyes of the people I was painting and the importance and the necessity of the work they were doing. It was totally changing my life. It became a mission. Each portrait takes about a week to create, and it consumes him until finished. The process for me is almost like falling in love. It's very intimate. I paint with my fingers. It's almost like sculpting. I've got my hands all over the face of every person I'm painting. Such is the gift an artist gives to the world, one often lost on the observer, at least consciously, but from which they benefit immensely. I'm communing very deeply with my subject while I'm painting the portrait, feeling an intense love for the person I'm painting. The process of doing this and feeling that way about each one is my antidote to despair and cynicism and anger about this country. He showed the first 10 paintings in the months before the war began. Because of how polarizing the debate had become, I was expecting to have to duck and run, because it was clear what I was doing and why. To his surprise, however, people began sending him money. Others called inviting him to speak about the people in the portraits, like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Emma Goldman, and Mother Jones, which enabled him to earn an income from this project. Some emailed suggestions for people to paint, for which he was grateful. I'd often find there was an incredible story there that I knew nothing about. One such story came through a friend, Deborah Menkart, Executive Director of Teaching for Change, an organization in Washington, D.C., dedicated to providing a greater teaching and learning experience for students and their parents and giving them the tools necessary to transform the world. Menkart had helped place Clyde Kennard's story into the curriculum of several schools. During a phone conversation with Shetterly, she told him about Kennard and suggested he consider him for his series. I'd never heard of Clyde Kennard, but once she told me about who he was and what had happened to him and the spirit with which he'd done what he had, he thought, wow, what a great story. As always, he began searching for images. As he researched Kennard's life, he became fascinated. Much of Shetterly's work had centered on civil rights figures, so painting Kennard was not a departure from those he was regularly drawn to. It is one of my goals to find stories like Clyde's and resurrect them, not simply to honor them, but to inspire others to fill in lost history, he explained. Many people know about some of the people who integrated schools in the South in the 1950s and 60s. What they don't know is who tried first and failed, was blocked, was martyred. Once this series became known, Shetterly unveiled his paintings publicly more and more, often to help various causes, to bring in one of his subjects to speak or to otherwise honor them. Menkart wanted the Kennard unveiling done in Washington and rented the room at Busboys and Poets. She also reached out to people who she knew needed to be there, such as NAACP Chairman Emeritus Julian Bond, civil rights activists Dory Ladner and Joyce Ladner, who had known Kennard in their youth, and comedian Dick Gregory, who had befriended Kennard and helped him financially shortly after Gregory rose to fame in the early 1960s. Other guests included former Freedom Rider Joan Trumpauer Mulholland, Hattiesburg native Eddie Holloway, then Dean of Students at USM, and NAACP attorney Kyla D. Crane. The popular youth slam team Split This Rock read excerpts from Kennard's writings. Aaron Jenkins of Operation Understanding, D.C., an organization dedicated to building leadership within Black and Jewish communities and eliminating racism and anti-Semitism from society, moderated the occasion. Menkart described the talks and presentations as touching and moving, and how they honored Kennard. The event lasted about 2 hours. Most memorable for Shetterly was a reading by Holloway of The Bridge Builder, a poem by Will Allen Dromgoole about an old man who built a bridge over a deep ravine for the next generation to cross. Holloway used that poem to describe how Kennard used his life to build a bridge for that same purpose. In the past 2 decades, Shetterly has painted more than 250 portraits in this series, growing it far beyond his original intent. When they are not traveling or rented out for display, they sit on racks in his basement. Shetterly is quick to point out that those he paints, like everyone, are flawed people, which adds to the beauty and meaning behind his work. Although these people made a difference in society, they aren't saints. When he speaks about some of the unknown heroes in the series, people often ask, why don't we know these stories? Why aren't we taught these people? They would empower us. Toward the end of the evening at Busboys and Poets, as the guests sat at booths, small tables, or on chairs tightly packed or scattered throughout the room, they focused their attention on Aaron Jenkins, who stood alone on the stage near Shetterly's portrait, which was covered in a borrowed tablecloth. With all eyes on Jenkins and everyone eagerly awaiting, he carefully removed the cloth to reveal Clyde Kennard, wearing a fedora hat, suit, tie, and, above all, his ever-present smile. The audience erupted in applause. There were many emotions behind the ovation, but one that Shetterly easily observed was that they knew what this man had suffered to claim his own dignity. For Shetterly, one of the many rewards of being an artist is restoring to his subjects a level of dignity that had been stripped away. And in an instant, during this unveiling, He did that for Kennard. People lingered, mingled, took photos of the portrait and of themselves with it. It was a satisfying night for Shetterly, Kennard's friends, and those who wished they had known him. The painting stood out from most in the series. I usually think that painting a smile on somebody is often almost like a mask. It doesn't help you see into the person's integrity. But he had a reason for choosing the photo he did as his inspiration. When it was taken in February 1963, Kennard was dying. Thus, with Clyde Kennard, that smile is such an act of courage and character. That tells you a lot about who he is. Some people's smiles don't. Shetterly painted a dying individual only once before, someone he had met in life. Humorist and political commentator Molly Ivins was near death when she visited Shetterly at his studio. As she sat smoking and drinking a beer, she gazed at the portrait stored there and complained that everyone looked so serious. "If you're going to paint me laughing," she insisted. "The only way to get these sons of bitches is to make people laugh at them." Her smile and her humor were essential to who she was. For Kennard, it was just the smile. In a way, Shetterly says, that smile was the thing that got Clyde through the world, even as he suffered. As with all his paintings for Americans Who Tell the Truth, Shetterly scratched a quote at the bottom. It was somewhat cryptic, but invited the observer to learn more. "What happened to me isn't as bad as what happened to the guard, the prison guard who abused me, because this system has turned him into a beast, and it will turn his children into beasts." Shetterly was drawn to these words because although Kennard had endured much at the hands of others, he managed to see a bigger picture, a tragedy within society far worse than his own personal suffering. To be sure, the racist does more damage to himself than those he hates. But Kennard also knew that racism and hatred could ultimately destroy humanity by one generation perpetuating and nurturing that evil on the next. "That just moved me enormously," Shetterly said, looking back on the day he first read Kennard's words. He had that emotional and moral distance to see that. Kennard's courage is ultimately what stood out to Shetterly. As Kennard battled for his rights, he paid a price by losing even those he had long enjoyed. He was an American who told the truth, and in doing so, he often spoke truth to power, despite being powerless himself. The portrait illuminates Kennard's story, and so too should his story, when fully told, allow a fresh interpretation of the painting. Such is the power of art when the subject, obscure or not, has that unique ability to move, enlighten, and thus illuminate us. In that sense, Clyde Kennard has emerged as anything but powerless. 1. A great warrior in battle. Clyde was like a great warrior in battle. He would not want us to stop now. Just as soldiers step over the dead bodies of their comrades to move forward, we must keep going ahead to complete the work he was trying to do. Reverend A.J. Benn, July 10th, 1963. Death at the hands of Southern lynch mobs was always barbaric, always tragic. It could be over within minutes, but the torture could last for hours when the most sadistic of vigilantes had their way. Yet compared to the death of Clyde Kennard, even the most heinous lynching was carried out quickly. It took several years for Mississippi's caste system to end Kennard's life, and those determined to rid him from their midst wore the cloaks of officialdom. The state of Mississippi killed his dreams first, but Kennard persevered. They finally killed his body, albeit slowly. But even after sickness had eaten him away and death was imminent, he remained determined to use his final days to help lift African Americans still living in a state that had systematically oppressed them, a state Kennard had never ceased to love. sitting in a bathrobe and pajamas in early 1963 at his sister's Chicago home, surrounded by friends.